Hello students, welcome to Lab 6, our final lab in this course, and one that's a little bit different from all the previous ones. So far we've really been focusing on the R language itself. We've looked at how to load data, how to analyze and visualize data. We've looked at some of the more programming related concepts like data types, at iterations, and regular expressions. All of that stuff is the core foundation of what you'll need to do the analysis itself. But as I've kind of emphasized throughout the class so far, especially in the lectures and definitely in these labs, visualization and presenting your results is an equally important, if not more important, part of data analytics, as is doing the analysis itself. So I know I've said this in a couple of labs, but it doesn't matter how cool and fancy a statistical tool you use, if your findings aren't digestible by VPs and directors and other people who are not statisticians, who did not go to school for data analytics, then you've kind of failed at your job, right? So today's lab, you can notice that I don't actually have a script open yet, because today we're going to be making a Markdown presentation. All of the slides that I've used in this class were made in Markdown. Your final presentation will ultimately also be created in Markdown. And so it's a good time for us to kind of go through that a little bit. So why don't we do that? And while we do that, I'll talk about what Markdown is a little bit, even though I've likely already talked about it in class. So we're going to go to File, New File, and R-Markdown. And when you do, this pop-up graphic UI is going to show up, and we can choose what type of document we want. We want a presentation, and we're just going to go with the standard IO slides. These are the slide formats that I've been using in the lecture and that you can probably use too. You're of course welcome to try Slidey or Beamer or even a PowerPoint, but you know, IO slides is cooler than PowerPoint. There, I said it. So we're going to call this Lab 6. And once we select that, you'll notice that we have kind of a pre-populated document. Now, I've gone over some of the basics of what is happening in a Markdown document in the lecture, but why don't we spend a minute to kind of go through that here too. First off, you'll notice that there are a number of key value pairs. So this is the key, this is like a variable, and this is the value. Most of these, if not all of these, are pretty self-explanatory, right? If I go in and I change the text of the title to be something else instead of Lab 6, when I create my presentation, when I knit it, that's basically creation, when I knit it, it'll have that title. And if I change my name there, it'll have something else. If I change the date, it'll have something else. An important thing to note is that this is a Markdown document. Markdown is basically like a general purpose way of writing such that you can turn this Markdown document into any number of output formats. For example, it shows you here that you could turn it into an HTML document, a PDF, a Word document. In our case, we're making a presentation. So write it once, compile it any number of different ways. You don't have to, as you can see, you can knit it to any number of different formats. That's what's so powerful about Markdown. One of the things that's so powerful about Markdown. So this is your header. It's called a YAML, but Y-A-M-L, but don't worry about that too much for now. For the most part, you can just ignore this. Once you've selected what type of document you want to have, that stuff will be auto-populated and you're more or less good to go. Only when you start to get to the more complex stuff will you have to think about that. Next, you'll notice that there are these lines that are basically highlighted a lighter shade of gray, blue, whatever color this is. And they're defined by a couple of unique features. First off, they start with triple backticks and they end with triple backticks. Everything in between is treated as some form of code. So what type of code is it treated as? Well, it's treated as R code. So after the first set of 3 backticks, you're going to open up a curly brace and you're going to close a curly brace. And you're going to tell it, hey, everything that comes in here is R code. Now, why do we have to specify this? Well, for this class, you don't really have to, but you may have documents where you want to use R, you want to use Python, you want to use some other language. And for example, you don't need to type all of this out. In fact, you can just go here to the insert code chunk and you can insert a code chunk, which is what this section is called, for any language, right? If we want to do Python, it just starts a chunk with Python, right? And then we can go and we can write our Python code here. We don't need that right now. We'll just stick to it. The first chunk that you set up, if you name it the setup chunk, is kind of special. So what happens in a chunk generally stays in a chunk. That information does not carry over from one chunk to the next. So for example, if I created an object here, if I assigned an object here, the default is that I would not be able to call that object in this chunk. Basically, think of each chunk as a completely separate R script, except for the setup chunk. So this is the chunk where I'm going to want to do things like call my libraries. And in fact, why don't I go to lab 6 and I'm going to say presentation. Great. So I saved my file there. So in the setup chunk, and you know it's a setup chunk because, surprise, it's named as setup, we can do things that will persist throughout this document. And we're going to want to do things like call our libraries. And in fact, why don't we read in our data? We're going to do the classic iris data set. So why don't I go ahead and run that? And sure enough, we loaded our iris data set. Now, when you do create an R-Markdown document, usually you're not going to run each one of these individual chunks. Usually you can just knit it and it'll be fine. But if you want to check that your code chunk is working before you knit your document, meaning turn it into a presentation, that's not a bad idea. Great. So far we've talked about this first part, the introduction part of your Markdown document, the YAML part. Now we've also talked about code chunks. Next, let's talk about how you create a new slide. You create a new slide by putting 2 hashtags in a row, 2 pound signs, and the title of that slide will be whatever comes after those 2 hashtags, after a space. So let's do something, and let's just delete all of this. This is a bit much. And why don't we write something like, this is some text that I want to show up on a slide, period. Let's save that, and let's knit it. And what we should get is a single slide, or rather 2 slides. It creates an intro slide for us. 2 slides, one is the intro. The second one is just a slide that's called R-Markdown, and it has this text. And let's see what happens. So we knit it. It's taking our file. It's turning it into a presentation. Ta-da! Whoops. Here is our first slide. Here's our first slide. And here's our second slide. This is some text that I want to show up on a slide. Terrific. So even though this just looks like the normal kind of notebook where you have been writing your R code in a Markdown document, if you write any text outside of a chunk, it's just treated as normal text, right? So we've gone through the R-Markdown workflow in our class lecture, but if we haven't, we'll kind of touch on that a little bit. What I want to talk about instead, and we'll use R-Markdown to do this, is to go through an analysis, right? How do you use R-Markdown in presentations to create an analysis? So one of the powerful capabilities of R-Markdown is that it can weave together code and text without you having to, for example, create a visualization, copy it out of the plot viewer area, and then paste it into a Word document. That's kind of cumbersome. Every time you want to change something, you have to run your code, you have to copy it again from here, you have to save it as a PNG or paste it into a Word document or something like that. That's not really an easy or sustainable way to do things if you care about your mental health. Instead, what we can do here in an R-Markdown document is just create a new chunk, right? So why don't we take a look at our iris data set? Why don't we run that and see what we got? We're pretty familiar with iris by now, right? So why don't I just make a visualization? We'll make the same visualization that we've made a few times. I'm going to call ggplot. I'm going to start an aesthetic function, and I'm going to say put sepal length on x, put petal length, oh my gosh, on y, and fill in the color with species, and then go ahead and add a geom point. And I want it to kind of look pretty, right? So let's do theme minimal. We've done this 4 or 5 times now throughout the course of the class, so we have a good idea of what to expect. And why don't I run this to make sure that it will run? And yeah, that's pretty much what we're expecting, right? We know this code works, but we don't know how it'll show up in our slides. So why don't we knit it and see what we get? And it shows up really nicely on our slide. Basically, it just shows up there. It has already done the automatic size reformatting to make sure that the visual fits within the margin of our presentation. It's embedded in the slide itself, which is just an HTML document. So it's very easy to kind of share with somebody else. And in general, we didn't have to stop doing our analysis to then write about our interpretation. And in fact, why don't we interpret this a little bit? Kind of as we've seen before, Setosa are small flowers, versicolor are medium flowers, and virginica are large flowers. So why don't we just go ahead and write that instead of this random text? So we can say Setosa irises are small, virginica and versicolor are larger. Cool. And when we knit that, we get pretty much what you're expecting, just the text. Now, I like to make my points a little bit clearer than this, right? There are different ways that we can emphasize parts of our text, and one of those ways is to bold our text. So, the names of these iris species, why don't we put them in bold? Markdown in general, and R-Markdown, have very interesting ways that are supposed to be easy of doing bold and italics texts. For bold, it's double stars, which should be on your 8 key. And so if we surround all of these species with double stars, they should be bolded. And sure enough, they are. They kind of help them stick out from the rest of our text, right? And you can see too that in the same way that RStudio highlights our code when we're writing our code for easier, interpretation, it also highlights text that will be highlighted or that will be bolded when we knit it, right? So let's say here, let's call this sample analysis. We got our sample analysis right here. I'm going to close this because it's kind of taking up space. But notice a few things. One, I didn't call the iris data set here in this chunk. I called it here in the setup chunk, and I can call it in every other chunk after that, right? Okay, let's start another slide. And let's say slide 2, distributions. Now, we've done a couple of things at this point. We've done regular text, we've done embedding a visualization, but there are other ways that we might want to communicate information. The first off is an unordered list. So we might say flower types include Setosa, virginica, and versicolor. And if we just put a dash and a space, our Markdown will turn that into a bulleted list for us, right? Don't forget to put a space in between any text and another flower. And I might want to make some other points. So for example, irises are nice to look at. They smell nice, I'm guessing. I don't know, it's been a long time since I smelled an iris. And 3, I don't care too much to classify them. It doesn't matter to me whether an iris is a virginica or a setosa or a versicolor. But you'll notice that I just made a numbered list there relatively easily, right? So maybe this slide wasn't about distributions in the end. It was just about my impressions of these particular flowers, but no matter. Either way, we were able to kind of make an unordered list. We were able to make an ordered list. And if I had something more meaningful to say about flowers that I have not already said in the 3 or 4 classes that we've used this data set, then I would put it here. But I don't have anything interesting to say about irises, so be it. So let's say slide 2. Let's rename this My Thoughts on Irises. Great. Sometimes I want to show the code that I've written, but maybe not the output. Maybe not the output. Here, we kind of had the opposite problem. We don't actually want to show this code, but we do want to show the visualization. So how do we do that? How do we show the code that we've written? Well, first off, why don't we go ahead and start our chunk. And inside of these curly braces, first off, it always needs to know that we are writing our code, but we're going to say echo equals true. Echo means, do I show this code on the screen when I render this? The second thing we're going to do is say eval equals false. And basically that means that I don't want you to actually run this code. I just want you to print it out. So first off, print it out. I want to see what this code looks like. And second off, after you print it out, don't run it. Just treat it as normal text. And here, we can do some of the things that we've already done. For example, we might start with iris. And we could say, okay, group by species. And then I want you to summarize by taking the mean of sepal length and average sepal length. And I also want you to take the standard deviation of sepal length, SD sepal length. First off, why don't we run that to make sure it's just correct code? And it does run, but we don't want it to run when it knits. So why don't we take a look at what that looks like when we knit it? Yep, just like that, right? You'll notice that this is the way that I've been displaying code to you pretty much throughout the whole class, right? I write some code, I show you how a group by function works, and then I'll say, okay, go ahead and run that and see what we get. We might also say, actually, I do want it to be evaluated. We might say, actually, eval equals true, although eval equals true is kind of the standard. So you don't have to write that, but I want to show you what it looks like when you do. And why don't we run that and see what we get? And then we'll do some interpretation of the subsequent table, and we'll go from there. Terrific. It kind of prints out this table for us, right? Wonderful. So we look at, well, setosa, the average sepal length is 5, versicolor a little bit bigger, virginica way bigger. And then the variance kind of goes up as you go up in the sepal length as well across the different species. Although this is kind of an ugly table, there are nicer ways to show tables, and one of them is with the package called Cable Extra. So anytime we want to call a library, whoops, we're going to go back to our setup chunk, and we're going to say, I'd like you to load Cable Extra. And it looks like I don't have it downloaded yet. So why don't I go in the console, and I'm going to say install packages Cable Extra. And it's going to download all of the dependencies as well. Now why don't I try to run it? And it pretty much works, right? Okay, let's go back to our code here. And we're going to say this is a pretty ugly table. I would like you to make it a pretty table with the cable command. Let's see what we get. That's, I think, much nicer. Maybe not wonderful, but a little bit more readable. So let's interpret this, right? We might say standard deviation goes up as average length goes up. So why don't we say that? Standard deviation goes up as mean sepal length goes up. I don't know why I capitalized all of those things. But sepal length. Okie doke. So we've done our interpretation. Let's go ahead and run that again with our interpretation, and we'll go from there. Terrific. So let's start at the beginning, right? We have our title slide. We've got our first slide, first meaningful slide. We looked at a visualization. Then we had some not very interesting things to say about flowers. And then we showed some code. We ran a table, and we interpreted it. Now, at this point, you've got pretty much 95% of what you need to be able to use Markdown effectively. And for your final presentations, I want you to keep it exactly this simple. I would like you to create a handful of slides with a handful of visualizations that you spent a fair bit of time on, making sure that they're very easy to interpret. And then I want you to spend one sentence on each of those slides interpreting that visualization for me. So what do I mean by interpretation? Well, let's go back to our slide here real quick. And by the way, anytime you knit, it's written out in the directory that you're currently working in. So even though I'm knitting over and over again to get this, actually the presentation is already saved in a folder. I just don't want to alt tab over to that folder. So what do I mean by interpretation? I mean, okay, you've made a visualization. You need to tell me what I'm looking at. That's what interpretation means, right? Here, this sentence is our interpretation right here. And I want you to spend time thinking about what it is you're looking at and what you're trying to get me and your audience in general to look at. This is a good template for you to use. One, maybe two sentences, one really clean visualization where the point is obvious to me. If your final presentations are somewhere between 3 and 10 slides, that's good. If you go any more than 8, 9, or 10, that's too many slides. Cut it down and focus on the visualizations you have. If you have fewer than 4 slides, you should think about making another visualization or having another slide on there, right? I want to see that you are diving deep into your data, that you're finding patterns, and that you're telling me what you found. What did you find in your exploration? I'm interested, right? One of the last, I know this is kind of a lab about R-Markdown, and it's worth thinking about for a second. Why did we bother to go through all of this instead of just using, for example, PowerPoint? There are technical reasons. The first is that, it's really difficult to do things like this in PowerPoint to show code. Other technical reasons are that it's very easy to go back and forth from coding to interpretation and going back and forth. You interpret, you look at your visualization, and you say, this needs some refinement. I might change the scale, I might change the colors. I might calculate some other variable and go from there. And you can hop between coding and analysis very easily. The last kind of qualitative thing to keep in mind is that if you don't have to jump between multiple tools, your work tends to be a little bit more efficient. The more kind of tools you have to glue together to get your general workflow in order, the longer you're going to spend just trying to get those tools to talk to each other. How long have you spent, for example, in a Word document trying to get a picture in the right place in your text, the right space, formatted correctly? The benefit of doing R-Markdown, especially for presentations, is that you don't have to grab these visualizations and move them around. You don't have to do any of that. Focus on your analysis. It de-emphasizes things that are not your analysis. So, as with the last lab, I think we're going to call it here, although this is not a particularly in-depth lab. This is really all of the tools that I want you to use for your final project. So as with all the other labs, I'm going to upload this to the learning management software. Go ahead and download it, although I would encourage you to kind of take this as a template and change it and add on to it for your needs, for your analysis, and go from there. So if you have any questions, of course, feel free to reach out and ask me. And I hope you have a wonderful day.